members of the committee. Thank you for welcoming me today for the opportunity to speak. My name is Jonathan McHale, and I serve as Vice President of the CCIA, the Computer and Communications Industry Association, which represents Internet, technology, and communication firms. CCIA was founded in 1972 to promote open markets, open networks in the computer and telecommunications industry, goals that we continue to champion today. No one, least of all CCIA, questions the importance of quality journalism to the civic life of a country and to the maintenance of a vibrant democracy. Nor is there disagreement about how difficult it has been for news to develop a viable business model in the face of technological change. But what kind of government intervention will support a sustainable market environment for all participants? I would like to offer some observations on approaches several other countries have taken and are planning to take with parallels to what you are considering in California. Interventions in foreign markets have taken different forms. Creation in Europe of a pseudo-intellectual property right beyond existing copyright intended to facilitate news businesses' ability to bargain, to negotiate licenses for their content, and Australia and Canada, introduction of a mandatory bargaining code governing the commercial relationship between news businesses and specific internet companies. What unites these two approaches is a controversial theory that fragments of text, or even just links shared online, should generate a claim of compensation. Not only does this upend long-standing international copyright law, but it also points a dagger at the very nature of the internet as an information-sharing ecosystem. These approaches are essentially a private tax in support of a business model under stress. There's no certainty that either approach will provide a long-term solution and much evidence that they will harm the quality of news in the digital ecosystem that they need to survive. First, the European approach. For over a decade, Europe has been experimenting with providing news intellectual property rights for news publishers, focusing on news aggregation services. This started with voluntary approach to licensing in Germany in 2013, a mandatory compulsory license in Spain in 2014, and now in 2019, an EU-wide law being implemented among member states. Germany's effort in 2013 failed. Companies offering news aggregation services simply pulled out of the market where publishers demanded compensation for mere links or short extracts. The large publishers behind the effort reportedly suffered a 41% decline in traffic, and they eventually agreed to issue a gratis license to be able to continue to gain indexing. The takeaway was clear. Indexing and carrying of extracts of news were much more valuable than the publishers would admit. And if forcing compensation resulted in firms leaving the market, the publishers were worse off. Spain's effort had more dire consequences. Unlike Germany, it made compensation mandatory, even if the publishers did not ask for it. It was essentially a compulsory license for news links, or what is often called a link tax. So smaller sites, most dependent on referral traffic, opposed this law. The main target of the law concluded that it could not justify maintaining a news aggregation site and shut it down at the end of 2014 before the law took effect. Other sites followed suit, and the results were predictable. Their traffic to news websites overall dropped more than 6%. For smaller publishers who were even more dependent on referral traffic, it dropped 14%. One concerning takeaway from Spain was evidence that it led to an increased fragmentation of readership, where consumers clustering around narrower sources of news. As one study noted, this undermines one of the most important conditions of democracy, which is access to a common and rich informational space. In 2019, the EU passed a new copyright directive, including an EU-wide right for publishers. Unlike Spain, this right excluded acts of hyperlinking and very short extracts of press publication. In France, the first member to implement this, it created uncertainty about the scope of what short extracts meant, and so due to concerns about liability, online suppliers required publishers to opt in if they wanted their content indexed. But publishers convinced French authorities to make indexing mandatory and issued massive fines for allegedly not bargaining in good faith with publishers who were seeking compensation. In the end, commercial deals were struck, but the end result was an imposition of a heavy-handed must-carry, must-pay regime that is arguably inconsistent with both EU law and France's international obligations. Australia. Australia's approach to market involvement began in 2017 with the Digital Platforms Inquiry. It focused on not on copyright or related rights, but broader dynamics in the online market, including advertising. As in other markets, newspapers in Australia have long struggled to build a sustainable business model. In fact, on a per capita basis, circulation in Australia has declined since the 1950s, so for over 50 years. The classified advertising, the mainstay of this business, plunged 90% in the last decade. The government candidly admitted in 2019 that this was the heart of the problem. It asserted that there was no suitable alternative to advertising-based model of news production. So what did they do? Their solution was a government-sanctioned mechanism of revenue extraction, targeting the one set of companies who were developing new advertising markets. This started as a voluntary code to facilitate bargaining between news businesses and digital intermediaries, but was suddenly abandoned in 2020 in favor of legislation of a mandatory code. It was highly controversial law. Critics included the smaller publishers, the inventor of the World Wide Web, the United States government, the Australia Taxpayers Alliance, and the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. Even the Financial Times opposed this legislation. Opponents saw a punitive and highly prescriptive intervention in the market on behalf of a select group of companies. The government's justification was that certain online companies qualified as, quote, unavoidable trading partners, and their alleged bargaining advantage justified government intervention. The market analysis has been refuted by the OECD, where a recent review of the issue noted that bargaining power imbalances are not uncommon in competitive markets. And this fell short of the typical competition trigger for intervention, which is substantial market power in a credibly defined market. One fundamental question in this context was, is there a bargain to be had? The notion that one should be forced to bargain in the first place for payments for snippets or links that the news companies allow to be indexed or postings that news businesses themselves initiate defies logic. Australia's approach willfully ignored strong evidence that the relationship between news businesses and digital service suppliers is complementary rather than competitive. Companies have documented hundreds of millions of dollars of benefits voluntarily channeled to news sites, the very targets of the legislation. As one small news publisher opposing the bill explained, it relied on the two targeted companies for 75% of its readership. During the debate, the bill, several compromises were introduced, and the final product was touted as a market-oriented solution. But it was nothing of the sort. The specter of arbitration, designed to assign compensation with no grounding in economic reality, meant that pressure to conclude deals lacking sound commercial basis would be the norm. In the end, two targets of legislation did conclude deals with a number of news businesses and thus, so far, have avoided designation. Predictably, up to 90% of the payments went to the traditional media businesses, with the lion's share going to News Corp, the biggest advocate of intervention and a company that controlled 50% of newspaper revenues. But these deals will soon expire, and at least one of the targets of the law has cast serious doubt on the long-term effectiveness. It called them an untidy, short-term, and unsustainable compromise. Fundamental questions remain unresolved. Whether deals will continue, whether, if designated, targets will remain in the market, how the bargaining code would work if actually implemented, and whether, if designated, targets would remain in the market. In short, Australia's experiment remains just that. An experiment has yet to prove its worth. As for meeting the goals of saving news, the initial data are not encouraging. News production initially increased in urban areas, but plummeted in non-metropolitan areas. By 2023, it declined even in urban areas, and in non-urban areas even at higher rates. In short, it is unlikely that forced payments are a silver bullet for the deep structural issues surrounding the economics of news production. On the other hand, the negative effects in Australia are significant, with increased media concentration likely. I'd like to turn to Canada quickly. Canada's Online News Act passed June 23rd and will come into effect on December 19th in just 2 weeks. Modeled on Australia's law, it is a bargaining code on steroids. It dramatically expanded the base of potential beneficiaries, and while there's a mechanism for platforms to avoid designation, discretion in granting the exclusion from mandatory bargaining is much more circumscribed. Implementing...
Mr. McHale,
yep.
I'm going to ask you to wrap it up.
Okay,
I'm going
sure.
to ask you a question about Canada. So.
Okay. One final point. Canada has announced the compromise approach for avoiding being designated under the law, but it remains, the policy appears to do more harm than
Thank
good.
you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.